Good evening, Fiji, and welcome to For the Record. Now, this evening, we are going to touch on an issue that many of us Fijians have been thinking of, especially with elections looming in September. 40% of the voters that will be voting in the next general elections are voting for the first time. We're talking about our 18-year-olds that have now, with the new constitution, been allowed for the first time to cast their vote in this year's elections. And with me is a young man from Levuka originally, but is also a lecturer at the Department of Sociology, Gender and Social Work at the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand. A very good evening and welcome to the show, Dr. Patrick Kalati.
Good evening to you too, Phil.
Now, you recently conducted a study on the democratic processes, especially concerning youth. Now, this was done under the banner of the Citizens Constitutional Forum. Now, tell us, young people of Fiji voting for the first time and their thoughts. Now, many of these questions that you've posed, or at least with your research. Now, look at young people. What is the state of young people in Fiji at this time? And how would you define young people?
Yeah, okay. The report basically had that as one of its objectives, to ask young people how they define themselves. It was interesting that at the launch of the report, we heard that the National Youth Policy does not have a definition of who young people in Fiji are. But based on the results of the report, a lot of young people were more favorable towards both a chronological definition of young people, as well as a social definition of young people.
Now, chronological would mean age.
Yeah, chronological meaning age, and majority of young people who responded to our questions preferred that young people be defined between 18 and 35 years. And one of the main reasons why the Citizens Constitutional Forum wanted to understand who young people are is because they go out a lot into the communities in terms of their advocacy work and their educational work. And in most instances, I think they're coming across older youth, perhaps those beyond 40 years. It was interesting that the results of the report show that the majority of young people that we spoke to perhaps preferred that those over 40s sort of move on and let the young people, particularly those between that age, 18 to 35, be defined as young people, and perhaps concentrate on activities or mobilizing what young people think they should be doing.
When you're talking about young people that define themselves with 40, we'd have to say that would mean the traditional Itoke settings, where perhaps provincial youth leaders have been tasked with their age, especially around 40 years. How did the research reflect how these youths felt also with what they've been told in regards to youth work and what they feel that the issues are also?
Yeah, I think one, touching on the age, I think in particular it talks specifically to the social context, where a lot of, in particular, youth leaders are perhaps beyond the age of 35 years, or even perhaps beyond the age of 40 years. And this is something that we cannot sort of change overnight. And it's something that the report recommends, that in situations where organizations or institutions, or even where young people engage in activities, that they target what they perceive to be a relevant youth definition based on the activity that they are engaged in. Because in reality, you might have certain activities in certain social contexts or certain cultural contexts where young people would be beyond the age of 35. So I think a lot of it is context specific, but in terms of what young people are saying, based on this particular report, the majority of them prefer to be defined chronologically between 18 and 35 years.
Now, how many young people were involved with this research?
Okay, yeah, we are involved about approximately 300 young people, 201 young people in our survey questionnaires, and another additional 100 in the focus group discussions across the 4 locations, Levuka, Lambasa, Suva, and Nandi.
Were there any specific reasons for the locations?
Yeah, the reasons were basically one, we tried to cover locations within Fiji's 4 divisions, and at the same time, for convenience, these are certain locations where CCF works in. They have very good contacts in these areas, and plus we were sort of constrained by time and resources and even technical support. So we had to work with the resources at our disposal.
Okay. How do you feel that the research would, with working with the focus groups, especially with contacts that involve the CCF, did it not affect the results of this? Would it have influenced the results of the research?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. No research is ever sort of value free. There's always bias in research. You try as much to be objective. Yeah, even the fact that we used convenient sampling to an extent, that's a point that needs to be taken into consideration. Yeah, and it's possible that those that the research assistants spoke to, in a way, perhaps whether directly or indirectly, have been involved with CCF, might perhaps have had or have formed particular opinions. But I think the important thing that the research tries to do was to listen to the voices of young people, regardless of where these voices are coming from. Whether this be sort of informed young people or uninformed young people. They've had very little opportunities, I think, for a very long time to be able to just share some of these concerns. Another point in relation to your question about the young people that we spoke to, there was also a general call for participation into the research. Advertisement went out, and a lot of young people as well responded to that advertisement. So, the point that you raised about young people somehow, either directly or indirectly, involved with CCF, perhaps might not, feature in that, because there were a lot of young people who responded to the advertisement wanting to be part of the research.
Okay. On that note, we'll just take a short break right here on For the Record. Welcome back to For the Record. This evening we're discussing a report that was convened by the young people, well, it's called Young People and Democratic Participation in Fiji, convened by the Citizens Constitutional Forum, and with me, the, young man that conducted the research, and I use the term young man loosely, especially after we just touched on defining young people in Fiji, Dr. Makawati. Now, just before the break, we touched on the focus groups. How young were the youth that were involved?
Okay, yeah, we worked with young people between the ages of 17 and 35. And there's a reason for this. The research adopted the concept of generation. We identified young people who were part of this research, or between the ages of 17 and 35, as belonging to the generation that is commonly known in Fiji as the generation of cool babies.
That's right.
These are young people either born prior to 1987 or just after 1987. And the research was interested in sort of understanding and exploring how this particular cohort of young people see themselves in relation to the democratic changes and reforms that are happening in the country, how the reforms and changes are affecting them, and at the same time how they're sort of responding and reacting to these changes.
I'm going to have to ask this. Did any of them mention the 1987 coup? And did any of them?
Not necessarily,
Not necessarily.
yeah, because I think it's perhaps, too removed. Perhaps
Yes.
it's something that they don't think about. They perhaps, have
Really
grown
have
up,
any
yeah,
memories
yeah,
of
grown
perhaps.
up in an era where, yeah,
How much influence did they have from family and parents?
yeah. Young people were asked certain questions that sort of included, whether families or parents had an influence in things like their political, you know, uh, uh, influences on voting behavior, and influences as to whether they've registered or not for this
Right.
upcoming general elections. There was some degree of influence from families, which would include parents, but it wasn't very high. In terms of voter registration, there were some young people who said that they were made to register by parents. In terms of voting influence, yeah, some young people did say that their families would have some influence as who to vote come September.
Now, how well aware are they of the, let's say, democratic process and how to vote in the next general elections?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. The research found that young people were very much interested in what's happening in the democratic reforms. Very much interested in voting for the first time, particularly first time voters. Yeah, very much interested in the process. But something that came out quite clearly in the report is their lack of preparedness to vote, and preparedness meaning sort of having an informed decision. And one of the main aspects of this is knowing how to vote. And perhaps it might have been premature in terms of when the research happened, and in terms of asking this question, because the Constitution came into effect towards the end of last year. The research sort of happened towards the end of last year. It was just a coincidence. And what young people knew back then in terms of voting was one vote, one value. But even then, a lot of young people, as much as they were interested, as much as they had registered, said that they would need assistance and help in terms of knowing how to vote. But we all know now that you have the electoral office, is engaging and beginning to work on voter education.
Now, from the respondents, how well did they understand the responsibility that they had in terms of the civic duty of voting, and how did they feel about the age being moved down to 18?
Yeah, I think from the report, a lot of young people, take this quite seriously. In particular, the young people that were involved in the study. And I think when we're referring to young people in this context, we're referring to young people who were part of the study. A lot of them take it quite seriously, because when asked as to why they sort of registered to vote as a voter, when asked as why they were interested to vote, as to whether they would vote or not, most of them said it was a responsibility. They also said that it was their right. Others said that they had something to contribute. So young people are very much interested. They feel that they have something to contribute. In terms of the voting age, as much as there was a lot of support, I think young people are happy that they are being acknowledged at the age of 18. Some even raised the point that you can get a driver's license at 16. So in a way that aligns, young people seeing themselves as responsible. But there was also, I think, some young people who still preferred to have the voting age at 21. The responses from the focus groups, when we tried to sort of probe their reasons for, or their perceptions about the reduction of the voting age, the majority of them sort of had comments like, they were not consulted about the reduction of the voting age. Others said that many young people in Fiji are perhaps not as independent as young people who live overseas in Western countries or in Western democracies, that many young people in Fiji perhaps are still dependent on parents and families and extended families, and and perhaps may be better and wiser that, by the time they reach 21, then they vote. So, there were sort of mixed feelings about voting at 18 and voting at 21.
Percentage-wise, would that have made a difference if they been consulted, do you think?
I think it does, to an extent, raise some, interesting sort of discussions. 54%, stated that the voting age is best at 18, and 41% stated that voting should be increased to 21. So the percentages are quite comparable, but I think, the 54% shows that young people are, perhaps open and acknowledge the fact that, they've been given a responsibility to vote, and they've embraced it. This 54% also might even reflect the fact that there were more sort of 17 to 24 years in the particular age category that we spoke to, that perhaps could have influenced that. The fact that there were more, young people towards that lower category that answered our question here.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to take a short break in. This is a really interesting discussion about youth involvement and also a democratic process. We'll come right back on For the Record. Welcome back to For the Record. We're continuing our discussion about youth and their involvement in the democratic process here in Fiji. Now, the recent study by the Citizens Constitutional Forum, we've got our head researcher here, Dr. Patrick Bakawati, who, now, just before the break, we talked about the involvement of young people and their thoughts on the upcoming elections. Now, let's talk about their attitude. From the different sectors, from Lambasa, Levuka, and in the urban centers also from, say, Suba and Lautoka. Were there differences, large differences in their answers, or not so many?
Yeah, there definitely were sort of differences, variations based on differences in experiences. As much as the majority were interested in democratic reforms, constitutional reform process, it was the issues that young people experience that are different. Unemployment was really high, as we've touched on before, but in places like Levuka or places like Lambasa, you had issues of transportation. In places, in those two places as well, you had issues of access to tertiary education. A lot of people brought up and questioned, why most of these services were mostly in the main urban centers, particularly on Vitilevu.
Well, that calls a lot to those who intend to stand too for political parties.
Yeah.
And now, with that in mind, how involved did they feel with the upcoming elections and in terms of information that are being disseminated to them?
Yeah. As I alluded to earlier as well, young people were very much interested in the processes. But one way of testing this interest was asking them about their involvement in the constitutional consultation process. The majority of young people who were asked mentioned that they did not take part in the constitutional consultations, either with the commission that was headed by Yash Gai or with the second consultation process by the government. For those that said that they took part, the majority again said that they took part in the first consultation process, the one by Yash Gai. Very few took part in the second constitutional consultation process. We even asked further as to why they took part. Yeah, many said, for those that took part, they said that they had something to contribute. There were others who took part because they were members of organizations that decided that they would make submissions. It was so interesting to see that there were other organizations, NGOs, that worked with young people, who mobilized young people, tried to raise awareness with young people in terms of working together to advocate for a voice. And these were young people that, that took part in the consultations. On the other hand, you had, the young people who did not take part, who basically said that, many of them were not interested, but a bigger number said that they did not know how to take part in the consultations. Again, I think this has implications and wider implications for how we consult, young people in the future, particularly national level consultations.
Well, with that, what you're saying, how did they feel that information was being disseminated to them? And how would they be receiving these types of information?
Yeah, many young people, when they were asked those questions, identified, I think our three main sources of information, the newspaper, the radio, and television. That ranked very highly. And they also preferred that, future dissemination of information, particularly now as we head into elections, that, information be disseminated through the same mediums. There was a response, quite good response as well, about information that young people access via the internet. Mm-hmm. But again, this is limited to areas where there is internet accessibility.
Right. So the hindrance would be coverage.
Yeah, and cost.
And cost.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of that, now with how did they feel about, well, say for instance, the elections coming up with issues? Did they feel that, well, an inclination that the political parties perhaps, or that would address the issues? Did they have any indication that how they felt about whether the issues would be raised?
Yeah. Political parties, yeah, and politics with young people is quite interesting. And I think it's general knowledge that historically Fiji does not have sort of an experience with, young people being politically active. Sure. Previously political parties have had youth wings, but I think the influence that they've had in terms of party management and party policies perhaps has been minimal. And it also showed in the report when young people were asked about their membership of political parties. Very few were members of political parties. But then I think they had some messages for political parties. They want political parties to be more responsive. They want political parties to perhaps involve them more in their youth wing programs, but there were others who said that they would just be happy to be involved somehow. But I think the challenge here is for political parties is then how do you involve young people? If a lot of political parties are sort of banking on the youth vote, the question is how do they sort of translate this willingness by young people to be involved, translate this willingness into sort of that political voice.
Now, as we are running out of time on the show, but I'm going to have to ask this: what's a general perception? How are young people, as we head towards the elections in September, are they ready for the elections?
Yeah,
Do you feel that they are equipped with the proper information?
I think based on the results of this report, young people are perhaps excited about the opportunity, excited about the prospect, about the fact that they will have an opportunity to vote, particularly first-time voters. The prospect of being able to have a say, and the prospect of being able to contribute and sort of steer, the country in a direction that they, sort of would want it to go. And I think that's why in the report we emphasize this idea of generation, because having an understanding of this generation, I think, gives us a window of how we will perceive, Fiji's democracy in the future.
Right. Well, the report, how was it funded?
Well, the report was funded by Conciliation Resources and Bread for the World.
Right. Now, just for the record, I'm going to have to ask, did it have any influence in the report?
No.
Gathering of the information?
No, the report was, as I said, written in a very objective manner. One of the briefs that I got in terms of the report was to ensure that it was written in very accessible language, and that's something that I've tried to do to ensure that anyone that picks up the report is able to understand it. And because CCF intends to use it as an educational tool to assist in their advocacy work and awareness in communities, and that's the spirit in which the report was written, to be very accessible, to be very sort of objective, reflective of the views of the young people that we spoke to.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pakoti.
Thank you.
And well, that calls a wrap to our show this evening. Thank you again for joining us. You can send emails and comments to fortherecord@fbc.com.fj. Good night, Fiji.